Hello everybody, welcome to Left on Right, where we give the left-wing perspective on right-wing media. Today we are going to talk about Tim Poole's video on leftist assassination culture. So before I dive in, I just want to comment that this actually sounded pretty convincing when I first watched it, but then I read the original study that this article is citing, and it does not give the same conclusion as what Tim Poole does. So let's let Tim Poole talk and then we'll discuss that in more detail later.
A new bombshell study shows that around 55% of those who find themselves left of center, let's just say, advocate for the end of Donald Trump and Elon Musk. We have seen other studies, we have seen other metrics showing the left overwhelmingly believes the use of violence is justified in pushing their political agenda.
So just before we let him go further, he uses this phrase, the left. The left is a huge number of people who have a lot of different views, and so it's not good to think about an entire group of people as the left or the right. There's a lot of people with different views, and the idea of using violence being justified is true on both sides of the political spectrum.
And it's coming to a head now. Pam Bondi is receiving death threats as she calls for the death penalty for Luigi Mangione. Movements across this country in support of Luigi, they are projecting images of Luigi Mangione as a saint, calling for him to be freed not because they believe he's innocent, but because they believe he actually assassinated a healthcare CEO.
So I'm going to agree with Tim Poole here. I do not think that idolizing Luigi Mangione is a good idea, and I also don't support political violence. Tim Poole seems to like to talk about the left being really interested in committing violence, and from his perspective, that may feel right. From my perspective, it doesn't feel right. So let's continue.
We have the attacks on Tesla across the country that are still ongoing with another.
It's another example of something I don't support. There's massive peaceful protests going around the country, and there's a couple bad actors who are doing property damage, and I think terrorism isn't a totally unreasonable thing to describe what they're doing, trying to make Tesla fear them, and I just think that's totally wrong. That is not a proper way to achieve political ends, and it's also just wrong to do that in general. So I agree with Tim Poole that those attacks on the Tesla dealerships are wrong. And I think that would be the general left-wing perspective, although there are some people who are obviously committing those acts.
Another story coming out of the Pacific Northwest and what appears to be another arson attack of some sort. My friends, Summer of Love 2.0 may be starting up, as this weekend we saw massive protests, either anti-Trump, anti-Israel, or in general, leftist, Western protests. They kind of just come together and coalesce around the idea that they hate what the West is.
So this is just a total mischaracterization of what's happening for the protests. So if you've been following the left-wing media at all, one thing that people are really upset about is deporting people with no due process. I did a video on that earlier this week. They're also concerned about cuts to Medicaid and Social Security. So Tim Poole's characterization of the goals of the protests are just totally not factual.
And they're willing to work with whoever to get what they want. Now, at the same time, we have Donald Trump's efforts in the marketplace with tariffs and other trade policies. This has resulted in a volatile market, which has a lot of people upset, namely older folks with retirement accounts. We'll take a look at these two.
I agree that there's been a lot of volatility in the market due to tariffs. I also did a video on that topic earlier this week, and it's not just volatility, it's also just a poor plan. Trump has not thought through what the next step is of actually making manufacturing happen. in order to make manufacturing happen, you really need to have subsidies, which encourage people to bring back manufacturing to a country where it's more expensive and there's less expertise.
Big stories. And I see the left increasingly becoming, let's just say, radicalized. And then I take a look at where the priorities of the political establishment is. It says to me that we are currently on a collision course for collapse. That is, Gen Z holds very...
So I can generally agree with what Tim Poole is saying, that the political establishment doesn't have a good solution for the fact that it's really hard to get a lot of wealth in this country, and especially younger people are struggling more than others. So let's now just go analyze in more detail this study here. So the new bombshell study reveals assassination culture spreading on the left under Trump. So Tim Poole is summarizing an article written by Fox News, and that article is summarizing a research study put out by NCRI, and there's a bit of telephone which is happening here where the original meaning from that study gets a bit lost. So let's actually just take a look at that study and see what it has to say here. So in the conclusion of this study, I think that's a good thing to look at to begin with. So we have, these findings should be interpreted in light of several limitations. Self-reported attitudes do not reflect actual behavior. Also, minor framing differences can alter responses and margins of error. Furthermore, the brief was exclusively focused on violence targeting right-wing figures based on high-profile incidents, but did not address significance of violence towards left-leaning figures. So Tim Poole is taking the results of this study and extrapolating it to say that the left has a much larger culture of wanting to assassinate political leaders than the right. However, that question is not addressed by this study. So there's a bit of a sleight of hand on Tim Poole's part where he's trying to compare the left and the right, saying the left is really extreme. But this study, the main results do not actually talk about that. Another thing that's important is that current differences in Democratic support for violence may serve as a loss to federal power, a claim that's buttressed by our models. So basically, depending on who's in control of the government, one side or the other might have more support for political violence. And they also cite another poll that they did in the appendix here. So if you look at the results of this poll, one is there's no justification for the murder of a political leader. 2 through 7 means there's some degree of justification, and you have Democrats versus Republicans. So you can see it is true that in this particular study, you had 70% of Republicans say justification, there's never justification for murder of a political leader. However, for Democrats, that is more like 60%, so there's a 10-point gap there. That being said, there is a pretty significant number of Republicans who also say there's some degree of justification for the murder of a political leader. The total numbers here, so 30% of Republicans and 40% of Democrats indicated that killing a powerful political leader is at least somewhat justified. This does, in this study, it does indicate there's more support among Democrats than Republicans, but this finding should be interpreted with caution. Elections have been shown to be associated with heightened polarization for months following the results, and sentiments may be prone to change. So basically, Tim Poole didn't look at this study in detail or deliberately misrepresented the results. So just some other stuff. Basically how you ask these questions has a lot of impact on the results. But if you look at this, so this is around the 2020 election. This is percentage of partisans who believe violence is justified to advance their political goals, somewhat justified. So you can see that in this framing and study, you had around 16% of Republicans and Democrats and a little bit more Republicans. So around 2020, Biden was in power, so that, and there's the whole thing about the election being stolen. So if you look at this study, you can see that over time, this is just an example of how over time these attitudes can change pretty significantly. And then here's another interesting thing. So when you talk about extremism, there's asking people who, do you support some degree of political violence? And then you can also say what percentage of people actually commit violence. So this was a fact checking that was basically saying, in their definition of right-wing extremists, we found 92% of ideologically motivated homicide incidents were committed by right-wing extremists or with a white supremacist motive. But then there's also discussion about left-wing and environmental extremists commit around 60% of all extremist property attacks. So depending on the particular type of violent act you talk about, you might get a different picture. So that's all to say that this original video was pretty misleading in the sense that depending on how you measure things exactly, and even just looking at the original study that he is citing, that does not support his point. So that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for listening to Left on Right. I hope if you are a Tim Poole subscriber that this was interesting for you to see, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Please like this video and subscribe, and I will see you next time.